Good evening, and thank you for joining Tala tonight for our third Nonprofit Essentials series for our third nonprofit series tonight on operations. I'm wanting to plug my next series from Strategy to Support, which is next Wednesday in Houston. It is a live event. We are going to have 4 nonprofit professionals, and we're going to talk board development, fundraising, and other engagement opportunities, and how these directors suggest that you engage mainly your board and your donors. So it's going to be some high-level discussion on a little bit different topic than we've covered on the legal and accounting side, and more about development and fundraising. So please join us next Wednesday in Houston at the Ion. We're going to have a reception from about 6 to 6:30. We're going to start the panel around 6:30, 6:45, and we hope to be done by around 8:15. And so please come out and connect with your fellow peers, connect with us, and meet the speakers. We would love to see you if you're in the Houston area. So tonight we have a guest speaker, Erin Rogers. She is going to be talking about a lot of things. So it's a kind of rapid pace tonight, and it's a little bit all over the place, but we brainstormed these topics together. And these are things that both Erin and I think are important that you should at least be aware of. If you're not an expert on some of the stuff, it's okay. But just to be aware of these things if you are on nonprofit staff, or you're the executive director, or on the board of a nonprofit. So it might be a little disjointed, because these are many topics that you have to know. If you're an executive director, you're expected to know a lot. And so this is kind of an overview of those things. So I'm going to let Erin start. A reminder, if you are on YouTube, you can ask a question in the chat. You have to be logged on to YouTube and have an account with them. It is free if you do not have one. You do not have to have an account or participate in the chat to watch. You can watch at any time, and this will be up later after our seminar tonight, so you can rewatch it or pass it on if someone was not able to attend. So again, feel free to put any questions in the chat. We do have some places during the presentation that we're going to stop for questions where we thought that it made sense, but feel free to go ahead and put in the chat also, and we'll try to get to your questions at some point in the night. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin, who's our primary person tonight, and I may chip in with a few things and also with our questions. So Erin, thanks so much for joining us, and take it away.
All right, thank you, Elisa. Happy to be here. First, a caveat that I've been sick for a while. I'm okay, but if I start coughing in the middle of this presentation, don't worry about me, just give me a second. Okay, so like Elisa said, we've got several different topics we want to cover tonight that we've broken down into a couple different sections. And the first one is a discussion about selecting your board members. So most of the time when organizations get started, a lot of times it's somebody and their spouse and their uncle and their mom. But as you know, your entire board cannot be made up of people that are related to you. And eventually you're going to want to diversify that board into lots of different ways. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But hopefully most of you have grown your boards to include people beyond your immediate family and friends, to be more in touch with the community. So, the first note we have on here, the selection of board members should not be an afterthought or something you rush through to get filings done, which is absolutely what happens most of the time. But after that, you should put some thought into who your board members are going to be to make sure that your organization is sustainable. Legally speaking, you need to have at least 3 board members, but practically speaking, you can have as many as you want. My general inclination in a smaller to small mid-sized organization is to have in the realm of 7 to 9, because an odd number is nice if someone has to abstain. And that's a good amount of people to have, people having an investment and being engaged in the work without also everything falling on just a few people. But if you have too many people on the board, a lot of times everyone loses touch and thinks someone else will do the thing, or it feels like they're not heard. So that's something to think about, how many board members you want to try to have. Ensure that your board members are representative of the community and also representative of the group that you're specifically trying to serve. We have forming and maintaining a board as an art. So there's a couple different approaches to building a board, and also a lot of appropriate discussion these days about breaking down the ways that boards have been dealt with and built in the past. So the traditional sense of a board is that the board is raising money. They don't necessarily have anything to do with what the organization does. They are philanthropists, or they are connected to people with money who can keep the board or keep the organization afloat. And often those people, you need them, but they're not always the ones who are in touch with the actual people that you're serving or the community that you're serving. The alternative to that, conversely, is to have a working board or an artist board where instead of that, you just have people who are engaged. Ideally, in my opinion, you need some mix of those things, because obviously you need money and access to money to do the things you're trying to do. But you don't want your board to be so out of touch with the community you're serving that they don't know what's going on or understand what that community really needs, which is a problem I see a lot, where they're like, well, let's do this thing. Everyone will like that. But that's not actually what anyone needs or wants. So a good balance of that is important. Also, a way to deal with this is to have advisory boards or to have committees, which we're going to talk about more. Let me see, do we have a slide on that? No. Okay. One other thing I want to mention here is that most boards can and should have a board buy-on, where board members are obligated to make some sort of financial commitment to be on that board. And there's a few reasons for that. One is psychological. Just there are studies that if someone has bought into something, they are going to also figuratively buy into that thing. So if they've paid to be there, they're more likely to show up and cooperate and take it seriously. Beyond that, grant applications will ask what percentage of your board members have bought in. That being said, we don't want to be inequitable. So if you have board members who can't pay, a way around that is a give or get policy, where you say board members have to contribute $300 to be on the board, but you don't have to write a check for $300. You can get someone else to give $300, or find another opportunity for the board that results in them getting $300. So there's ways to deal with that, and ways to work around that. It doesn't always have to be make all of your board members give the organization cash. Organizations must keep up practices to actively engage the board. Lack of engagement can lead to non-compliance. Yes, your bylaws will dictate how many board meetings you have to have per year. Legally speaking, you only have to have one. That's a bad idea to only have one. It's up to you how many board meetings you want to have. Elisa, how frequently does Talos board meet? Quarterly or more often?
We meet once a month, usually.
Once a month. Okay.
And I just wanted to mention, I didn't mention, we have a resource packet that has a whole lot of articles and information about boards in it. So you can get that either from the chat, or you can get that on the event page on our website for tonight's event. Also, I wanted to say part of what we'd love to cover next week with our 4 experts is how they choose board members and how they engage board members and what type of activities their board members do. So we're not really getting into a lot of that part tonight, but that is something that we'd love to ask our experts next week. So again, I think we'll be covering a lot more about actually maintaining and engaging a board next week.
Right. So going back to board meetings and frequency, it's really up to you. I'm on a couple of boards and we all meet quarterly. So which for what we're doing is realistic. In some instances, you may need to meet more than that. I wouldn't recommend meeting less frequently than quarterly, just because it's going to fall out of people's minds what they're supposed to be doing. And also this compliance issue is important. Board versus staff. There probably no one here makes this mistake, but this is a common mistake for people to not understand what an executive director actually is. An executive director is not a board member. That is a staff title. And it doesn't matter what the context is, whether they're, a volunteer or an employee, et cetera, but executive director is not a board position. The leader of the board is called the president or the chair. That's up to you. Most boards have this structure that we have here, having a president, usually a vice president, sometimes 2. Some organizations that I work with will have, for example, like artistic vice president and business vice president, and they have different tasks. Treasurer, secretary, and one person can serve 2 roles, but the president can't be the secretary, so that you can't make meeting minutes that say, we all voted to do this, and I, the president, said that was fine. So there has to be some separation there, and that is a state law. But otherwise, those things can overlap. You can also add additional board titles if that's important to you. Again, I've worked with arts organizations where they have a specific board position for artistic programmer or something like that that's not a staff role. So that's something to think about. Titles, again, executive director is a staff role, artistic director, staff role, and any other jobs that you might have someone whose specific job is development, which is fundraising. All of those people are going to be on the staff and not on the board. So the reason that's important is there should not be too much overlap between what those two groups of people are doing. Obviously, some organizations have working boards where they don't have any staff. I'm on a board like that where we all just do the work. We all vote on what theater we're going to produce, etc., because we don't have enough money to have a staff. But ideally, you have two separate groups. You've got your board and you've got your staff. So the executive director, the board makes the overarching plan of what the organization is going to do. They uphold its mission, etc. They develop the budget. And the executive director is in charge of carrying that out. So there should be an employment agreement in place that shows what the executive director is supposed to be doing, what their obligations are. And that's best for everyone, because another thing that happens in nonprofits a lot is, of course, a lot of us don't have a lot of funds. So we ask one or two people to do the jobs of 9 or 10 people. And you want it to be clear as to who is responsible for which tasks, and not having scope creep where you end up having your executive director do things that a development director should be doing, etc. Annual review, just like any other employee, nonprofit corporations are corporations. So all of these other things should, be the way you would treat it in any other sort of entity. So often, especially in newer organizations, I will get asked if the executive director can be on the board, if they can also be an officer. The answer is legally yes, but it's not ideal, because at some point, if you're being paid to be the executive director, which you can be while being a board member, but you have to abstain from that vote. So you can't vote on anything that would benefit you. And at some point, it just becomes unwieldy when you can't vote on half of the decisions because they are for you. And it's also not a good look. Again, this is pretty common in the beginning when organizations are getting started and they just haven't recruited enough people yet. But eventually there should be a plan to move away from that so that the executive director is not on the board. Responsibilities of board members. I mean, most of you already have organizations, I assume, so you're probably familiar with most of these things. We talked about meetings, but the annual meeting is the one that you are required to have by the state. And that's where you would typically hold your elections, et cetera, and also make your annual signing of your conflict of interest policy, which we did provide a sample in the packet that Elise is going to provide to everybody. That's just a statutory policy regarding conflicts between, disclosures of conflicts. Like if the board is going to hire my law firm to do some work for the organization and I'm on the board and I work at the firm they're hiring, I need to make sure everyone knows about that. It's not that that's illegal, but it needs to be disclosed. We already talked about board meetings, yes, at least quarterly. This is a big one. A lot of times people's bylaws are either very old or they got them off the internet from someone else, and it does not actually allow for virtual meetings. If you are meeting by Zoom or any other platform and you don't have it in your bylaws that you're allowed to have virtual meetings, then technically, if someone wanted to object to anything that happened at that meeting, they could, and it would be moot because you're not allowed to do that. So one of the things that I end up doing is auditing nonprofits' documents. People will hire me because they've been around 20 years and they want someone to check their documents out and update them. And this is probably the biggest thing that I see, is that people have not updated their bylaws to allow for virtual meetings. You are obligated to keep meeting minutes. I think we have another slide on minutes later. Is that right, Elisa? Okay, so we'll come back to that. And also, board members should ideally sign board member agreements. The bylaws should be kept lean and mean in general, and then you can have separate policies for other things, which makes it easier to revise them as necessary so that there's a little bit more flexibility. But board members should sign board member agreements, which, in my opinion, the main things to put in that, other than the obvious, you have a fiduciary duty to the organization, et cetera, is to have some sort of policy in place. Like if you miss more than 2 consecutive meetings, we can remove you as a board member. And that just takes out some of the personal, touch. Like no one wants to just tell a board member to leave or vote them off. But if they've signed a contract that makes it easier to say, well, you missed 3 meetings, so unfortunately you're removed from the board. It takes out some of that personal sting in those situations. And that's also where you would address what those obligations are to the board if there's a financial obligation from board members. Responsibilities of board members, fiduciary duty. I mentioned that briefly. This is a big one that I also see a lot. Guiding the strategic direction of the organization and not submitting to one person or the founder's vision. So boards are obligated to make sure that the nonprofit is sticking with its mission and that the activities that they are doing are aligned with its mission. That's not to say the mission can never change, but it needs to happen in that order. And sometimes this happens because the thing that the nonprofit was set up to do has changed, especially in our artistic landscape. It's possible, what if you set up your nonprofit to like burn CDs to distribute to the public and now no one listens to CDs, so it's time to pivot. That's fine. But before you start pivoting, you need to change your mission statement to align with whatever it is you're going to do now and then do that thing. So board members need to be cautious about that. It is their obligation to make sure that everything is chosen for the good of the organization and in support of the mission. Navigating conflicts of interest. We talked about that a little bit. I would say for the most part, there are a lot of things that are conflicts of interest. That doesn't mean that you can't do them. There's actually a lot of flexibility in what you can do with a nonprofit. Like, for example, like I said, I can totally be on the board of the organization and the organization can hire me to do legal work for it. There just has to be disclosure of that. There has to be, I can't charge more for that service than I would charge someone else, at or below market value, So most of it's just about disclosure, making sure everyone properly votes on everything and that everything is approved. But there's a lot of stuff that is a conflict of interest that's actually okay as long as you're navigating it correctly and in accordance with that policy. Okay, some things to consider. I already mentioned give or get policies. Term limitations. I definitely have thoughts about that. So some organizations will have a fixed number of terms that board members can serve. So for example, there's a big organization here in Houston I'm aware of where their terms are 2 years and you can serve 3 terms, period, the end, 6 years, and you're out. The advantage to that is that you don't get burned out so much. But the disadvantage is you have a really fantastic board member and they hit that 7th year, they can't come back. The flip side of that is to allow people to be elected over and over again for all of eternity. And the problem with that, with organizations I've worked with, is that you end up with people who've been on the board since the 80s and who donated something to the organization in 1992, and they haven't done anything since. Maybe they show up, they're not doing anything. And the board is hesitant to vote them off because they're like, well, she donated all that money 20 years ago. And it's hard to remove people when there's no real tangible reason that they're not good board members anymore. So my personal choice is to allow for a certain number of re-elections. So say it's 2-year terms, you can serve a 2-year term, you can serve 3 times. Then you have to roll off the board for at least a year. So then you have to actively come back to the board, be nominated again, or apply again to come back. So that way, if you're wonderful, you can come back. But if you are dead weight, then we can just sort of let it go and no one has to make it feel personal. Diversifying funds. I just had this conversation with a client today. Again, when you first start an organization, a lot of times it's just one person's money or one family's money. But if you're going to be a public charity, you eventually have to have a plan to diversify your funds because you cannot get all of your funds from just one donor or one person. So the board, one of the purposes the board serves is hopefully bringing in money from different sources, from different people, from different grants, etc. Community accountability, obviously super important, especially in the nonprofit world. And that also goes back to living in conjunction with your mission statement and making sure that the things that you do are in line with the mission. And a robust committee structure, which we're going to talk about again in a little while. And also there is a good handout on committees that we will talk about. I feel like committees are underutilized in general. You don't have to have a ton of committees all the time, but you can form a committee for a specific purpose to get something done. Not everyone has to do everything all the time. Hiring. So we talked a little bit about board members versus staff members. So Again, all of the rules that will apply to any other corporation apply to a nonprofit corporation. So make sure you're really cautious about not misclassifying contractors versus employees. And there is some gray area here. I mean, there are obvious things. If you hire someone to fix your website and they're going to do that by July 1st at their house, whenever, as long as they get it done by then, that's obviously a contractor. If you're telling someone they have to be in the office 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and here's a computer, that's obviously an employee. But there's a lot of gray area in between where it can be difficult to decide what somebody's role is. So just be cautious about that. There's also instances where someone starts as a contractor and they sort of separately become an employee over time because they're just there more and more and you're paying them more and more. So at that time, it might be time to switch it up and make sure that you're paying them properly and classifying them properly. And there are programs you can use to manage this sort of thing if you're not sure how to deal with employees. And Elisa, what's the one that Tala uses?
We use Gusto.
Okay. And you like it?
I do like it. It's pretty good. I noticed that we've got a comment from a CPA. And so if she has other suggestions other than Gusto, she might want to write them in the chat for us, because I'm sure there's other ones too, but we have liked it. It's fairly easy to use and it's great because I'm not an HR expert and it does walk me through a lot of things that I need to know.
Right. So don't be daunted by, if someone should properly be an employee, don't misclassify them as a contractor just because it's easier and you're not sure how to do that. There are systems out there to help you with that so that you don't get sideways with the IRS later.
And I would advise, if you do have an employee, to use one, because like for Tala, we use one. We have 3 people that are W-2 employees that work regularly every week, all year long. And just the time and effort to try to figure out the taxes owed and all the IRS implications ourselves would be ridiculous. It's so much easier and it's so much cheaper to hire somebody. Just as an example, for Gusto, we pay less than $100 a month to manage that. And so it's completely worth it because it's going to take more than $100 worth of your time, trust me, to probably figure it out in the end. So I would definitely look at some of those platforms that will do it for fairly cheap, and then they'll ensure that you're compliant with the IRS for your employees.
Right. So with employees, you are obligated to pay into the unemployment system, and you definitely want employee agreements in place. Texas is a right to work state, so anyone can quit and you can fire them within reason. But make sure that you have that in place so that everyone is on board and understands what their compensation is. If there's any sort of extra stuff that they're getting, what that is. You do have to be cautious about that in the nonprofit universe about what you can and can't give them as benefits and bonuses, but document all of that. Interns, this is another one that's complicated. And this was something that there was a big crackdown on this after the financial problems around like 2008, because people were firing their employees and bringing on interns to do the work that the employees were doing just to get away with not paying someone. So there's a lot of rules about interns and what they can and can't do. The job, an internship should be for the benefit of the intern, not for the employer. It can't just be to replace someone's job. And you can't make them be an intern for a certain amount of time before they're eligible to be an employee. So for example, back when I worked at Tala, we always had law students who interned for us, and I would have them do legal work. And some of them knew what they were doing, but a lot of them, this was their first job like that. So it took me time to review their work and to give them notes on it. It was not saving me time to have them intern for us because I still had to review all of their work and often change a lot of it because, again, it was their first time ever doing anything like this. So that's an example of what an intern should be doing. If they're essentially just taking the place of an employee, you might end up with a problem. And these are free internships, by the way, unpaid internships. If you're paying your intern, then they are an employee and do whatever. But if it's an unpaid internship, then you have to abide by these rules. All volunteers, there's also some rules around volunteers. There's some protection around volunteers as well, but they cannot be paid in any concept of the word. If they're going to be volunteers, you're going to take that. So you can't even give them gift cards or anything like that. I know that happens all the time. Realistically, it's a nice thing to do, but technically now you've paid them, so they're not just volunteers anymore. And I have t-shirts on there unless it's relevant to the role. So for example, if you are Bayou City Arts Festival and your volunteers are trying to help people find where the bathroom is or where the water station is, obviously you want them to be wearing Bayou City Arts Festival t-shirts so people can identify them. That's fine. But if you're just giving people like, oh, here's a Tala t-shirt for volunteering, that would be something that would constitute payment. And now they're not technically volunteers anymore. Okay, before we get into questions, I want to go through Lisa's questions that are in the chat real quick, because these are good questions. Can you identify board term limits in a separate policy, or must it be in the bylaws? That is one thing I would absolutely put in the bylaws, not in a separate policy. Board member policies are for other stuff, like you asked about compliance. Is this compliance for the bylaws, state or federal requirements? When we're talking about board member compliance, the main thing, I mean, well, there are federal and state laws you have to comply with, whether or not you've signed off on those things and bylaws. That just is what it is, like the fiduciary duty. You can't just take money from the nonprofit and spend it on yourself, obviously. You can't just hire yourself without having board approval and abstaining from that vote. But and mostly, I mean, in conjunction with a board member agreement that identifies what compliance looks like, which again is something like you must give or get $300 per year to be on the board, and you must agree to sign the conflict of interest policy. And if you miss 2 meetings, you're out. And also Lisa noted a free option for contractor payments. Elisa, I don't know if you want to pop that in there so people can see it. There you go, ramp.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on being on a board. Just because you didn't show up for the vote and weren't there doesn't mean you're not responsible for what the board does. So if something goes sideways, even if you haven't participated in the last 6 months, you're still going to be liable for things that the board does. And I think a lot of people don't really understand that. So while it's hard to prove that somebody engaged. To be liable, you don't even have to prove whether they engaged or not. Just by essence of them being on the board, they are going to be held responsible. I noticed it. I know in the handout, there's some things that, in the financial policy of the sample of financial policy, the one that's given, the first line is that financial oversight will be done by the board of directors. And I just want to say that because it's very important that the board make sure everybody's paid, make sure the contractors are paid, make sure the money's being used correctly. That's actually the job of the board, right, over the ED. And if you're on a board and you're not doing anything and you're not showing up and something goes sideways, you're still going to be liable for that. So I think it's a situation where sometimes a board has to police itself, because I've been on boards as an executive director where a board member is not pulling their weight or not showing up, and because everybody's volunteers, it's a hard conversation to have with that board member because they're all volunteers, and really it's not the executive director's place to have it, because the board should be policing themselves in a way and making sure that they're doing the right thing. And so it gets really hard. But I think the conversation to someone that is not participating and showing up is like, well, hey, are you sure that you have the time to be on this board? Because if you're not contributing, you would still be responsible for the decisions that your peers are making. And maybe it's better that you roll off until you have the time to contribute the way you should, or just try to, do that the nicest way possible. As an ED, if you're an ED, you don't want to be doing that by yourself. You need the board to back you up on that, right? Because the board should be talking to each other and collectively managing the organization. But it is something you could talk about to your board president, and bring it up and say, hey, I'm concerned. This person hasn't been here. How do we want to address this? But it's definitely.
And stay on top of that, because I personally have resigned from boards because other board members made me nervous. Especially as a lawyer, I'm like, I cannot be on a board where people are doing these things. So don't lose your people.
Just reinforcing the CPA Lisa Certinovic. Hello, Lisa, tonight is saying, do not do payroll yourself. And so just another thing, it's unless you're an HR expert, it's just better to let somebody else do it. And then if it gets messed up, you have somebody that's liable for that and you don't have to worry about it.
Yep. All right. Okay, that was our longest section. So now we're on track here. Governance maintenance. So as I mentioned, people hire me to do audits of their paperwork to make sure that it's up to date. So the certificate of formation used to be called articles of incorporation. If you're an older organization, it's the same document. Now it's certificate of formation. Most of the time, there's nothing that you're going to have to change there. But something to stay on top of is that sometimes organizations do change their mission, as we've mentioned. And if you're going to change your mission, you should go back and file an amendment to your certificate of formation. You don't file a new certificate of formation. You'd file an amendment with the state reflecting that new mission statement. Pretty much anything else, you don't necessarily need to file an amendment for. Unless it's a very explicit corporate choice. Like, for example, I don't know how familiar everyone is with the concept of members with a capital M in a nonprofit. But like, for example, if you were a membership organization and you decided you didn't want to be or vice versa, that's something that you'd have to change. But otherwise, not much to do there. But it is worth staying on top of it just to make sure nothing's drastically changed. You don't need to update it.
Hey, Erin, a question on that we get sometimes. If somebody's what they're wanting to do doesn't exactly fit within their mission well, is it better to amend that, or is it better to start another nonprofit organization?
I would say it depends on how far it diverges from what their mission is. Like if they're an arts organization and they want to open a homeless shelter, start a new nonprofit organization. If they're an arts organization and they want to start an educational component, I think you could just amend your mission to incorporate that because it's probably close enough to what you're doing. But regardless, you do need to, again, revisit your mission statement. Just don't go off the path and just start doing new stuff. And also some of it has to do with who's going to be involved. So if it's exactly the same board and they've all decided they want to also do this other thing, there may be a way to keep it under the same entity if there's not a liability reason why not to. Okay. That's a complicated question and very much is going to be.
Does the IRS review those new activities?
So you're obligated to keep the IRS abreast of any of those changes. You do that in your 990. If you're drastically changing it from what you got your 501c3 for, then that looks, again, a little bit different than adding a new program or changing it. And again, this is a hard question to answer because there's so much nuance in that question. But I guess the thing to take away is don't just haphazardly make those decisions. You may or may not need to file something else with the state or with the IRS if you want to change your mission, which is why there's such an art in writing mission statements in the first place, to try not to pigeonhole yourself into something so small, but also to make it clear what you're doing. I see a lot of things on both ends of that. Like the example I always give is we're going to present Shakespeare plays in Memorial Park. Like, what if you want to present a play in Herman Park? Now you're not in your mission anymore. And then I also see ones that are just so many buzzwords that I read it and I'm like, I have no idea what you do. I don't understand what you just told me. So there is really an art to getting that mission into something that might cover reasonable things you want to do. But again, if you're totally changing it, there are some things you'd have to do with that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anyway, reviewing your bylaws is probably more important to stay on top of than reviewing your certificate of formation. Some organizations have it built in that they review their bylaws. They have a bylaws committee that pops up every fill in the blank number of years, 3 years, 4 years. Some just do it as necessary when they decide it's time or they realize their bylaws don't address something that they need them to address. Or again, technology has changed and now we need to include being able to meet by brainwaves or whatever it is that exists now. So staying on top of your bylaws is important. The bylaws are not filed anywhere. You do give a copy to the IRS when you first submit your exemption application, but if you change your bylaws, there's nothing you have to do with those. So it's not that, I mean, your bylaws will have the policy within the bylaws as to how to change them. A lot of times it takes more than just a majority vote. So look out for that. But again, you can do that at any time and you don't have to file them anywhere. So as long as you're complying with your own bylaws. Again, I recommend keeping the bylaws pretty clear. So obviously there's stuff that has to go in there, but things like getting in the weeds about financial policies and whatnot, your bylaws can just say the board can adopt by resolution a financial policy, and then you put that financial policy into a separate document. Beware of AI. I personally, I'm not saying I never use it, but it doesn't get all of this stuff right. It doesn't know your particular situations. So be cautious of, first of all, cutting and pasting out of other people's bylaws and also cutting and pasting out of AI. You know, there's plenty of resources out there for people who can help you with this, including Tala. So find someone to help you with that because bylaws are one thing that you don't want to get wrong. I already talked about updating for changes in technology. And again, using separate policies for specifics. We provided some of those separate policies within the packet that Elise is going to give you. And there's also a list that we're going to show you in a minute of some of those policies you might want to have. Documents you need to keep on hand, your certificate of formation and all the amendments to it. If you don't have those for some reason, they're all online if you're in Texas. Anyone can log in to the Texas Secretary of State, set up an account, pay $1, and you can pull any of these documents, yours or anyone else's. So if you're looking for your certificate of formation or anything else that's been filed, you can go get that. Your bylaws, like I said, those are just internal, so hang on to them. Your 990s aligned with your retention policy, which we have another slide on later. Your meeting minutes, also in alignment with your retention policy. Keep a copy of your 1023, which is your exemption form with the IRS. Although if you don't have that, again, you can get a copy from them of yours or anyone else's, but it's a slow process to get it. So better to just hold on to it. And again, everyone must sign a conflict of interest policy, which we provided you every year. And that is a question that the IRS will ask and sometimes grants as well. Okay, here's our list of policies that we recommend. I mean, you can have as many different policies as you want, but these are some common ones that pop up. A document retention and destruction policy. So I would be curious to hear what Lisa says. A lot of the document retention policies that we use are either 7 to 10 years. Some things you might not have to keep that long. Some things you can have a 3-year retention policy. And some things you need to keep forever, which is basically the stuff I put on that prior page. So your formation documents, your bylaws, things like that are going to be necessary forever. On the note of document retention and destruction, there's a balance there. You don't want to keep things forever for legal reasons, because if you end up in a lawsuit, which I hope that you don't, and somebody wants to go back and get documents from you for however long period of time, if you have a clear document retention policy that says we keep documents for 7 years and then we destroy them, and you have actually destroyed them in accordance with that policy, now you don't have to provide them. So, don't put yourself in a situation where you're having to do the work to turn over a ton of stuff, which you don't even necessarily have to have anymore. But on the flip side of that, if you're in a lawsuit and someone says, give us your bank statements for the last 3 years, which is totally reasonable, and you don't have your bank statements for the last 3 years because you didn't retain them, that's a problem. So come up with a document retention policy and also a destruction policy, both for physical documents and for digital documents.
Yeah, in the handout, there's a little grid and there's a bunch of things written on there, like the 1023, your formation documents, and those are recommended as permanent. And then most of the other on the sample document are 7 years. And that's what I usually see. Like you said, 7's about the shortest as far as payroll, IRS, things like that.
Yeah.
And so you can look at that, and everybody has a different mission and different things that they keep. So you can definitely adjust that to things that you have too. A lot of it, if you're a theater and your people are paying a lot of ticket things like that, that may be shorter, right? You may only need receipts like that for 3 years, things like that. But just use your common sense. And there is a sample. It can be as detailed as you want it to be. The sample just kind of, I feel like is the bare minimum, just to say, well, we do have a policy. We have thought about this, and we are either protecting the data or, like she said, destroying it when it's applicable. I've seen so many organizations that don't we're just not going to destroy anything. That's not a document retention policy. I mean, part of the retention policy tells you when you're going to destroy it. And I've seen organizations that have written credit card numbers down from some silent auction they did, 12 years ago. And no, that's a liability on you. You don't need to have people's credit cards from 12 years ago. So you have to kind of balance that and think, what is the best policy for not just keeping things, but also for destroying them.
Right. Financial policy, we're not really talking about your budget here. This is more like, what are staff members allowed to spend? Do they have a separate bank account? When can they just go use the credit card? Because you don't want a staff member to have to call you every time they go to Office Depot and need to buy a ream of paper. They should be authorized to do that. But at the same time, you don't want them to say, I just booked a ticket to Paris for this conference surprise. So there needs to be some sort of policy in place, both about what staff members can do and also about what board members are obligated to do. So frequently there will be a requirement that any check lower than $5,000, I'm making up a number, can be signed by the treasurer or the president, but anything greater than $5,000 has to be signed by 2 different board members or approved in writing if it's an online thing. Board member agreement, we already talked about that. I'm going to come back to employee grievance. Scholarships and grants, this goes both ways. If you are providing scholarships and grants to other organizations or individuals, when you applied for your exempt status, you would have provided the IRS with the policy and your acceptance strategy and how you decide who gets an award. So you want to keep track of that, and also of whatever documentation you have told the IRS you're going to keep track of in the provision of those. So if you said we're providing grants and we're going to require written reports, you want to keep those on hand for whatever your document retention policy says. The flip side of that is if you are receiving grants, then that grant may have certain requirements as far as what you're obligated to keep and to report and over what period of time. So make sure you're staying on top of that. And of course, every granting organization has different policies about what they want and the formatting and all that stuff, which is why a lot of times people have someone just to manage that, because that can be its own job. But yeah, so that goes both ways. Code of conduct.
If you have a federal or government grant, it's going to tell you how long to keep it, and just make sure that you pay attention to that, because those are the government ones are the ones that sometimes if that program gets audited, it could trickle down to you, and then you're going to get audited. So just make sure you, if you have especially a government grant, that you understand how long you're supposed to keep records.
Right. Code of conduct, I believe we have a sample of one of those in the handouts. That can look like a lot of different things. That can be some of the things we already talked about board members and their obligations, and then obvious things like I'm the attorney for an organization where every time they start a meeting, they circulate a code of conduct that reminds everybody to not interrupt anyone during the board meeting, etc. And I've actually found that to be extremely helpful and nice. And we go to these board meetings and everyone has just been reminded not to be a jerk. And, you know, it goes a long way. The other thing I see that is sort of related to code of conduct is I have some clients that are organizations that have like their own code of ethics because of whatever it is they're upholding. It could be something like, I mean, non-discrimination policy, obviously we already have on there. But if they have a particular view, like for example, if they're a religious organization, they may have policies around that. Like you won't do anything that brings ill repute to our church or something like that. So that could vary by organization. Social media policy, super important because there's a lot of trouble you can get into this with this stuff. And it also overlaps with advertising rules. So I think we talk about that on a different slide. But in general, who has access to your social media? Who's going to be the keeper of the passwords? Who can say what? If you have interns or staff who are working on that, what access do they have? Because you don't want to be in a situation where somebody like circumvents you and kicks everybody off of the thing, or where somebody is out there being wild and saying stuff they shouldn't that's not in alignment with your mission statement, or violating the advertising rules about sponsorships, which I know we have on another slide, so I am going to come back to that. The one that I skipped is the employee grievance policy, because Elisa, I want you to mention that because you had some thoughts about that. So.
Yeah, we at Tala, we do have an employee grievance policy. We're very small. We have a couple of contractors that routinely contract with us, and then we have 3 staff members. And our policy is that anyone that is not comfortable coming to me as the executive director can come to the president or secretary of the board. And it's just plainly stated to pretty much everyone we work with that, you know, if they're uncomfortable coming to me for whatever reason that is, whether or not the complaint is about me, that there's a way to do that. I feel like it's very helpful in small organizations in particular, where there's not a chain of command that's very obvious of who's next, or if there's very loose titles where you don't really know who's managing who or who you should go to. I think it's good to have something as far as an employee grievance policy. At Tala, we go as far as we work with a lot of clients. We also have like what we call our member or client grievance policy, right? If someone has an issue with that, and we do have policies on how to handle that internally. So there could be other policies that are in internal and external about the public. If the public has an issue or a problem, how is that handled? Is somebody going to handle that, or is that just going to be ignored, or what is that going to be like? But I think that would depend on your nonprofit and how you operate. So I would just say that even external and internal grievances, you should at least think about it and probably address that with your board, because they're going to be probably the last stop for those.
Thank you. Okay, social media policy. I talked about that, but the thing I do want to come back to is the advertising and promotional rules. So we might have this somewhere else too, but there are rules about what a nonprofit can and can't say about its sponsors. So for example, if Ford sponsors Tala can say, "Thank you, Ford, for the nice sponsorship money." And they can put Ford's logo on their stuff. But what they can't do is say, "Everyone at Tala drives a Ford," or "I love my new F-150," or make a Facebook post where they link to a Ford dealership where someone can purchase a truck. That is not okay. And a lot of times people just don't know that. So if you're going to have somebody who's going to be posting on your social media who might be thanking your sponsors, make sure that they're aware of that, just so they don't get you in any trouble with that. Minutes. So this is a big question that comes up a lot. Minutes do not need to have a record of everything that happened in that meeting. They just need to include the basics. So the date, the time, who was there, when did the meeting start, who made a motion, what was that motion, did it pass, did we make any resolutions, is there anything that new business that came before the board, what time did we adjourn? That's really it. You don't need to say, "And then Elisa suggested that we do this, and then Lisa thought we should do this instead." Like, that's not, it doesn't matter what you talked about, it matters what you decided to do. And there's plenty of examples of minutes out there. I'm not sure we found one that we liked enough to give you in the handouts, but because there are so many bad versions of minutes out there, which is not to say that you'll get in trouble for keeping too extensive of minutes, but it's just not helpful. So, and sometimes it can get you in trouble where you say too much, but
right. And yeah. I just want to say the most important thing is any votes or resolutions that the board made, you have to document that. And you do need to watch that. It needs to be documented how it was proposed to the group. It can't be in your translation. Like, yeah, we voted to accept so-and-so gift. Maybe, but was there conditions, we're going to accept it on this or that, or what are we going to do with it? It has to be the way that it was proposed by the board member. So just make sure that your minutes are reflecting exactly what the board is voting on and using that terminology. And usually you have to have a first and a second, and you would have to say those people and who right. proposed the resolution, and then you have to have a second. And then we usually always put unanimous, or you would need to put how many accepted yes and declined. You can't just say majority pass. You're going to have to document, how many voted yes, how many voted no. You also should put in your minutes every single time board directors present, board directors absent. How many times I look at meetings and they don't even say who was there. So, you don't know who voted. Yeah. Because you don't know who was there. You don't know who wasn't there. So just little things like that. I wish I had a little bit more time. I would have loved to put a template in there, but I didn't find one that just had everything.
Yeah, we didn't find one we liked. I don't usually list the people who weren't there, but I do make sure that the people who are there are listed.
Right.
Right. And also before the next meeting, you should circulate those minutes and have the board review them so that at the following meeting, those minutes are accepted and acknowledged, that everyone has read them and agrees that this is what happened in the meeting. Yes, we approve them. So they don't just go straight into the record. They need to be approved.
Right.
And then Elisa pointed out that this is a thing that's important too. The president should be leading the meeting, not the executive director. That is the president's main job, is to be the chair of the board meetings. So that's a thing that sometimes happens where they expect the executive director to lead. Executive directors may or may not even be at your board meeting, but if you do have them there, they can't vote on anything because they shouldn't be employees. And you may not want them there if you're talking about them, but if you want them to come in and give a presentation about what's happening or whatever, that's totally fine. That's up to you. But they are not supposed to be leading the meeting. And again, they definitely can't be voting on anything if they're not on the board. So the questions I'm seeing, is it wise to establish a digital repository and then destroy physical documents? So that would be something that would be in line with your retention policy. If it is within the window of when you should be retaining something, most things you could make a digital version. But if you're going to make a digital version, make sure you're destroying that version when you destroy the physical document at the end of its retention period. As far as what to keep real copies of, I think you can use your common sense in that regard. Like if you're getting paper bank statements, there's no reason you can't just make digital copies of those paper bank statements. If you have some sort of important contract that was signed in ink and that's how you received it, I would suggest holding on to that paper copy. That's my inclination. It's not necessarily that it's not enforceable if you only have the digital copy, but personally, I feel better keeping physically signed copies of things if that's what they were. These days, I mean, that's not even super common because so many things are e-signed. There are still certain things where the IRS will require a wet signature and also possibly the bank, depending on the situation and what it's for. Yes, certain IRS documents do still have to be wet signed, and I tend to hold on to those, but you don't necessarily have to, depending on, again, this is a case-by-case basis. There's so many different kinds of documents and different kind of questions. But if it's something where there is already a digital version or something like that, there's no reason to keep the paper copy too. But just make sure you're deleting the digital copies at the end. Elisa, are there any other questions I'm not seeing?
No, we just had a question about, is there one place on the IRS site that might list how long you should keep things? I don't know that there's one particular place for that, unless you happen to know of that.
No, and the IRS doesn't have specific policies about literally everything that you might be doing internally.
Right.
So like Lisa said, there's different 3, 5, 7, and 10 are the popular years. I tend to lean towards 7 years for most things, other than the stuff you should be keeping forever. You know, again, there might be some things like Elisa said, where you don't need to be holding on to a certain receipt for 7 years, so it might not be relevant. But there's definitely policies out there. I don't think there's going to be one IRS website link that tells you exactly everything you should do with every document you have, because they don't care about every document you have. So only the ones that have to do with your IRS reporting. Okay, pivoting entirely to a different thing. So I imagine most people here are working with arts organizations, so this is important. If you've heard me speak before, this is something I talk about a lot. In my practice, I do about, I don't know, I want to say it's 50-50. I do a lot of nonprofit work, but the other thing I do is entertainment and IP. So this very much falls into my wheelhouse and overlap here. So nonprofits end up owning a lot of intellectual property. That could be copyrights, which include your creative works like plays, books. I know Tala used to make publications that we would give to artists on different topics. So literature. You might end up, if you're a theater company, perhaps you've recorded a play for archival purposes, or if you're a music organization, you might have commissioned some new music or made some recordings, and it ends up that you own those. So copyright lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years, or if the organization owns it from the beginning as a work for hire, which is a whole other conversation, it's 95 years from when it's published, or 120 years from when it was made. So trademarks are your branding elements. So that is your company name, a logo that you might have, a slogan that you always use. Nonprofits can have trademarks. Those have to be renewed. Copyrights, you file them once, it's yours forever. You don't even have to file them, you already have them. Trademarks, you do have to renew at the 5-year point, the 10-year point, and every 10 years after that. But something to be cautious about, and we don't have it on this slide, it's somewhere later, is permanent dedication of assets, which means all nonprofits own the things that they own. And if they dissolve, they are obligated to give all of their assets to another nonprofit organization. And that includes their intellectual property. So to the extent that intellectual property can be kept outside of the nonprofit, if it's important, like if you're the founder and this organization is producing plays that you wrote, there are ways that are not a problem for you to keep the rights in that play and not give it to the nonprofit and just allow them to produce it. As long as you're paying yourself, again, at or below market value. Often you would charge nothing because it's your organization and you want to be on the up and up with everything. But at the end of the day, if something happens to the organization, that's still your play. There are some instances in which this is unavoidable. Like if the nonprofit gets a grant to produce a concert series and you bring in a videographer to record it, and now you own this video and this recording. Obviously, that belongs to the nonprofit. It came from grant money. It was something where the nonprofit paid for it. That's going to be theirs. But something to think about with nonprofits and IP is keeping all that really clean. So I sort of mentioned that who owns the work. Was it something that you already had? And this also goes for educational stuff. So like if someone developed a curriculum that the nonprofit is now using, did they already develop that curriculum before they ever started working with the nonprofit or started the nonprofit? Then that's still theirs and they're licensing it to the nonprofit to use. If it was developed with grant money on the nonprofit's dime, then the nonprofit's going to own it. It's a work for hire. Did you use work time or resources to do it? Clean up all of that with licenses, just so everyone's on the same page about who owns what. I already mentioned permanent dedication of assets. And if you need to use copyrighted materials for things, be familiar with Creative Commons and open source. I wish I had time to show you, but Creative Commons is a system that allows owners of copyrighted works to share them under a certain license without you having to contact them. And there are different parameters they can set on those licenses. So for example, they can allow you to make changes to, usually it's photos. They can allow you to make changes to the photo so you can put text on it. You're allowed to use them commercially. So there's ways to search both Google Images and the other one, I'm forgetting the name of. Anyway, another photo site that's very popular that I suddenly cannot remember the name of, to search for Creative Commons images. And when I worked at Tala, I use it all the time because when we were making promotional posters for our events and whatnot, I would find photos that were licensed via Creative Commons and use them to make artwork. And then you credit the author or the artist, obviously. But there are ways to find things like that. It's not just photos. That's just the most common thing that's used as Creative Commons. There's a lot of text that is, and there could also be music. But there are ways to find things out there that you can use. The flip side of that is do not assume that because you are a nonprofit that you don't need to get a license or that things don't apply to you. I see that happening too. Like, but it's charitable. I didn't make any money off of it. Infringement doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you made money off of it. I mean, obviously you're going to be sued for more money if you made more money, but the infringement is not based on profit. It's based on a statutory damages. So it doesn't matter how much you made or did not make off of the thing. It's still copyright infringement if you took something and didn't license it. So be careful about that. Commissions are a big one that comes up, especially in music organizations. Who's going to own the commissioned work? Is it a work for hire, which means that the organization owns it? Or does the author keep the rights in the work and the organization just gets the right to perform it first? Both of those things happen. Neither answer is wrong. Some of it's going to depend on who the artist is and who the organization is and what they're able to pay. I work a lot with an organization here in Houston called Musica, and they commission works all the time and do both of these things. Mostly they allow the artist to keep the work and they have the right to perform it first and also the right to make a recording of that performance. But beyond that, the artist, the composer can do whatever they want with it because it's theirs. And often though, they do have to credit, like originally composed for Musica or with, you know, funding from Musica or something like that whenever they publish it elsewhere. Royalties get messy. Some organizations, for example, if you were Musica and you'd recorded a bunch of performances and you wanted to put out an album and you wanted to pay artists a percentage of the sales of that album, you can do that. It's an accounting nightmare. So sometimes it sounds like a nice thing to do. Like, we want to support our artists by paying them a royalty off of these album sales. But for everyone's sake, it can be a little easier just to say, we're going to put your song on this album. Here's fill in the blank number of dollars. We're going to press 1,000. We're done, you know. And you can manage that with mechanical royalties. But if you're using a recording that person played on, it gets more complicated. What I'm saying is if you're putting recordings out, you should probably talk to someone at Tala because music is the most complicated thing in the copyright universe. Pretty much everything else is more straightforward. So that can get messy. And ancillary uses, can the organization do anything else with that work that it commissioned? So going back to music, can they then make a documentary film and put that music in it? Can they make remixes and put out remixes of this work they've commissioned? So make sure all of that's clear and that you're getting whatever rights it is that you are expecting to get from those commissions. And relatedly, licenses. So I just mentioned that there is a large organization in Houston who will not be named that got a letter from ASCAP back when I worked at Tala because they were holding events and having musicians play, and they did not have a license in place, and they did not think that they needed to have a license in place for the music they were using because they were a nonprofit. Again, not true. Most of these entities do not care if you're a nonprofit. There are some organizations you can tap into. Like, for example, there's an organization for dance instruction. So if that is what you do, you may be able to get your music covered under that entity. But for the most part, if you're having an event and you have music at it, you have to license that music through ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC, and GMR. We have these 4 entities that license music in the US. Again, complicated, but it's putting it on your radar. Also, TABC licenses. If you're having an event with alcohol or with food, and it's not at a place that does that, you need a license for that. And Elisa asked me to talk a little bit about raffles, because this is a big thing that there's a lot of misunderstandings about, and how many school cheerleader fundraisers are infringing on this law right now. In order to have a legal raffle in Texas, you have to have been a 501c3 for 3 years. You cannot have a raffle before you've been a nonprofit exempt organization for 3 years. After that, you can have 4 raffles per year. And there are certain things you have to disclose on the tickets that you sell, including the name, the organization's name, and the price that was paid. And the reason why is that raffles are gambling, because the person purchasing the ticket is putting money in. It is completely based on chance as to whether or not they get anything, and the thing that they get has value. So this does not apply if you have an essay contest, because you're choosing a winner. This does not apply in a silent auction, because there's no chance involved. It's the person who pays the most money. But if you're giving something away in a raffle, they bought a ticket and they win a prize, that's gambling, and you have to abide by these rules. How much are they enforced? I don't know, but don't get on the wrong side of it. Make sure that you're doing that correctly. And we are going to supply, it's the Attorney General office that oversees this, so we have supplied those rules within the handouts that you will get. Questions. So I see in the questions, where do I access the form to file a DBA? So that depends. If you are a nonprofit corporation and you are filed with the state, you would file, it's called an assumed name certificate. You would file that with the Secretary of State. So you'd log in. It's very easy. You put that you're going to do it for 10 years. You pay your $25 or whatever it is, and then you're done. If you are talking about more generally and you do not have an entity set up, then DBAs are filed at the county level. So I know we're here talking about nonprofits, so that's what 99% of you are going to do. But just practically speaking, if you're just an individual and you want to have a side hustle, you would go register that with your county, and it's a little bit different. And I know in Harris County, it's like $15. But yeah, you file that with Secretary of State, $25 last 10 years. And then the other question we have in the chat, how do you suggest the board manage a board president who attempts to overstep their position, and how they manage the ED? I mean, there's some art involved there, but your bylaws should include a way for board members to call a special meeting without the president calling that meeting. So that's probably what I would be prepared to do. Is usually it takes 2 board members to call a special meeting, get someone else on board to do that with you, call that meeting, and talk to the president. But I mean, a lot of that's just going to be interpersonal dealings. And also, you may be able to go to mediation. There are some free options for mediation if this becomes a really big issue and you want to hash it out with the president and or with the ED. I don't know, Lisa, if you have any other suggestions on that one.
Yeah, I'll just say it kind of depends on, I'm not really sure what they mean by overstep, but this is where having really sound policies about how you spend money, doing an annual budget every year where everybody's in agreement how to spend money, who they're going to hire, not who they're going to hire, but what their budget's going to be for hiring, things like that. So if it's a financial thing, that could possibly help. It also, your bylaws should help in direction as far as management. You know, the board is supposed to be collectively managing the ED. So I think what you said about if there's any way to maybe get a couple of other board members to agree to call a special meeting to talk about any issues that there might be. It's really hard for me to say without knowing exactly what you're talking about, but the more policies that you have on the how you're going to operate, and also on what you expect of your board. Maybe you have a board agreement. This is what the board is supposed to do, where you can point back to like, hey, you're in the weeds on my day to day, and that's not your job. Here the bylaws says it's not your job, or this job description for the president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, whatever. If that may be part of the issue, you at least have something in writing to fall back on and say, here's what I think that you're infringing on this. It's hard. Like she said, it's kind of an art, it's all thinking about, what do you want to happen? Do you just want it corrected? Do you want this person to leave? There's just so many variables that you would want to consider probably before either one of us could give a good example. Unfortunately, that's a lot of soft interpersonal negotiation skills that are needed.
Yeah. And that's why I would suggest possibly mediation if there's no other way around it, because like I said, there are some free mediation resources you might be able to do. And also, unfortunately, at some point it might be self-correcting, because your executive director might just quit, and then maybe the president understands that. So okay, quick on tax compliance, because I know Tala did some other presentations on this, but it's worth mentioning again briefly, is to make sure that you're staying in compliance with this. You do have to file every year. If you don't file for 3 consecutive years, you'll lose your exempt status, and then you have to just refile again. There's no real getting it back. Doing that for someone tomorrow. If you're under $50,000, you file the 990N, which is extremely simple. You just log in, say, this is our address, these are our board members, yes, we still exist, yes, we made under $50,000, check, done, easy. If you're over 50 but under 200 and under 500K in assets, you file the 990EZ. Still relatively simple, although at that point I would recommend having someone prepare it for you. And the full 990, definitely you want to be working with someone who knows how to do that, because there's a lot of it. I think a lot of people misunderstand, and of course y'all are already parts of organizations, so you already know this, but a lot of people getting started think that this is going to be easier because they're doing something nice and charitable and it should be easy, but it's actually harder, because the IRS really wants you to justify why you're not giving them taxes on this money. So there's a lot of disclosures involved and a lot of nuance. So I would definitely hire an accountant if you're filing the full 990, and probably if you're doing the 990EZ, unless it's very simple. From the state perspective, so once you get your IRS exemption, hopefully you have all filed for exemption from the state as well, in which case you do not have to make any sort of annual filing. They will occasionally send out a letter to make sure you still exist. So make sure that you keep your address current with the state, both with the Secretary of State and with the Comptroller. But otherwise, some states do have an annual filing obligation where you make some sort of report. We do not. Sales tax, though, if you are collecting sales tax on anything, which if you're selling t-shirts or something like that, then you would need to be doing that. Then that is a quarterly report. You need to have a sales tax number. And you can have 2 annual sales tax holidays. So for example, if you have a gala where you're going to sell a bunch of stuff, you don't have to pay sales tax on that one day. But if you're regularly selling t-shirts, you should be collecting and paying sales tax on that. Fundraising, donor solicitation, acknowledgements. Paying fundraisers, this comes up a lot. Fundraisers in general should not be paid a contingent fee. It's not illegal, but it's very frowned upon. And a lot of professional fundraising organizations will explicitly not allow their fundraisers to do this. And the reason why is, if you're giving the nonprofit, if you're giving the fundraiser 10% of whatever it is they're raising, that might make sense up to a certain threshold. But at some point, if they're really successful in their job, you're paying a lot to this person doing the fundraising and diverting that money from the organization's actual mission and what it should be doing. So it can be a problem mostly for the nonprofit more than the fundraiser, but it's just ethically not really ideal. If you're insisting on doing it, I would recommend putting a cap in place. Like, we're going to pay this fundraiser 10% until they hit whatever reasonable amount you would have paid somebody flat fee anyway. Separating donor advised funds. Elisa and I talked a little bit about this. Donor advised funds doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. If somebody is truly offering a donor advised fund, they really have a lot of control over where that money goes. That's different than like when you donate to your college and you say, I want my money to go to the music school. That's not necessarily a donor advised fund. So being cautious about that. A lot of organizations just choose not to accept donor advised funds. But if someone comes to you and wants to give you $1 million as a donor advised fund, you're probably going to figure that out. Acknowledgement versus advertising, I already talked about that. And sponsors are related to that same thing. So again, don't advertise on behalf of your sponsors. You can credit them. You can say, thank you for the great donation, whoever, but you can't link back and sell stuff for them, essentially. Deductibility. This is another thing where I see a lot of confusion in the real world, and not just from organizations that are getting started. Sometimes I'm glad for phone calls because of the faces that I'm making when people tell me some of the things that they're doing. So you have to give a receipt if you get a donation over $250. Donations of services are not deductible. So as a lawyer, my regular rate's $350 an hour. If I give Tala an hour of my work, I can't go write that off on my taxes. That doesn't mean we don't want to keep track of it, because some grants will want to know what the value of services donated was, like how much free service is Tala giving. Well, when I did an hour of work for Tala, that was $350 in value to someone, but I don't get to write that off on my taxes. So that is a mistake that I see happening. Donations of artwork, because a lot of us here are arts organizations. Artists who are donating artwork cannot write off the value of that artwork or the amount that it's sold for. They can deduct the value of the supplies that they used to make the artwork. Silent auction receipts. I have argued with people about this one before. If, for example, you auctioned off a guitar and that guitar was worth $100, and in the silent auction it went for $500, then that person should get a receipt showing that they made a donation of $400 because they also got a $100 guitar. Same thing goes for when they purchase gala tickets. There should be a value for that dinner. So if they're paying for a $1,000 table for 10 and the dinner itself is worth $50, that needs to be written off, or $10,000 table for 10, written off in the value that they're actually getting a receipt for, less the value of whatever they received. And keep track of your donor information for the 990, because you do need to disclose donors over a certain amount. So donors can't really stay anonymous unless they gave you $10, and that's fine. But otherwise, you need to be keeping track of that because you will have to report it. And again, this is just a really quick overview. You should definitely talk to an accountant if you have more specific questions about this stuff. But I just wanted to touch on some of the common misconceptions that we see, especially with the donation of services and with the value of a receipt not including the amount of the item that was actually received. Unrelated business income, also important. You are obligated to pay tax on any income that is from sales or income that is not related to your organization's mission. So if you're a theater company and you're selling tickets, that's not unrelated business income. But if you're selling t-shirts, that might be unrelated business income. So you want to keep that to a minimum. It's kind of annoying that on one hand, you want to become sustainable and you find a way to make some money because people really like the stuff that you're selling, but you can't sell too much stuff or you will lose your tax exempt status. A way around that that's pretty common, if you find yourself having a very successful side thing that is not directly related to your mission, is to have a hybrid situation where you have an LLC that manages that. So just going back to my theater example, some theaters, for example, may have a space that they own or costumes that they've amassed, and they will rent those costumes out or rent their space out for other purposes. They can have that as an LLC that owns that stuff and then lets the theater use the items and the space, but then can also rent it out to the public for money. So there are ways to manage that, but be careful about it, that you're not making too much money from things that aren't related specifically to your mission. And super quick discussion of insurance. We are almost done. A couple kinds of insurance you might want to consider. D&O, which stands for directors and officers, protects your directors and officers within reason. So under the statute, board members, as long as they are acting within their capacity as board members, should be indemnified by the organization, but that doesn't mean that the organization has money to do that. So this insurance covers that sort of situation where the organization or a board member is sued for something related to the organization. Some people won't join a board that doesn't have this insurance because they don't want to be responsible for something. And make sure you're purchasing the right writers. So tech, breach of tech, working with children, auto policy, volunteer policy, whatever applies to you. If you have a relationship with an insurance company already, most main insurance companies will offer this. So you might want to talk to them. If not, I don't know if we might have some recommendations for places that we like. Employment is the #1 claim faced by nonprofits. Also dealing with that right now for an organization that just got sued by a former employee. So that's a thing. General liability insurance, something that you can have in that is things that cover your intellectual property. So be careful about that. But also general liability, important if you are having events that are open to the public, things like that. And then workers' comp, which is obvious what that is if you have employees. All right, I think that's the end. So any final questions before we let you enjoy your evening?
Moving quickly, just back to the insurance, I also want to say that if you are an arts organization that routinely does performances and events, you would want to, of course you need general liability, but you really need to look at what you have. You may need more money in certain buckets for that insurance. I found out the hard way through Tala that because we don't do a lot of events that are considered production of theater or dance or anything like that, ours was very restrictive. And while it was covering us for our things that we might do educational wise in classrooms, it wasn't very good if it was something like if you have over 200 people and you have a band, then it doesn't cover it anymore. And it was just kind of some weird things. And so I think if you do events and that's what you do, you want to make sure that you have event insurance that's covering the event that you're doing, and making sure that if it's something that, if you have a lot of bands and you're constantly doing something outside, or you're constantly doing something in a public park or whatever that might be, that you talk with your insurance company about the events that you do, and do not just assume that the coverage that says general liability is going to cover you. Because as you congregate people together and put them together, the more capacity that you have, the more insurance will kind of start to ask you what you're doing. So if you have an insurance company that's not asking you what you're doing, but they're providing you general liability, you need to be asking them what it covers and read the policy, because I've seen a lot of organizations that do not have the coverage that they assume that they have. And it comes from grants, like in the city of Boston. If you get a grant, they just tell you they want XX general liability, and that's all they say. So people just tell them, just give me this, and then they take whatever the insurance gave them without looking at any of the specifics, or if there's riders, or if they need specific things. It's also cool to think about what might be a risk for you, just to make sure that it's covered. I mean, artists do a lot of different things and creative interactive things. So, make sure that you think, is there any risk to the public if I'm doing this, or if I'm selling a ticket for this, and discuss that with your insurance. Insurance is hard, guys. I just struggle with insurance as it is. And it's one of the top questions that we get at Tala, and we don't have an insurance agent on staff, and none of us are considered insurance professionals. And I just kind of have to, unfortunately, read the boring policies and just make sure that I'm comfortable with what our coverage is. And so that's just a small bit of advice on insurance.
All right. Well, thanks, y'all.
Yeah, see, one other thing that we probably need to fix our slide, there also is a business personal property tax for the county. So we may need to add that. We didn't mention that. So just to be aware, that is something else that you would want to be aware of as an organization for the property that you own in the county where you are conducting business.
And that's a business property, not necessarily like a location. Like if you have equipment or cars or whatever, that's the sort of thing you're listing there. So.
And I think, Erin, we did pretty good.
Yeah.
An hour 20. I think that's all we have. I appreciate your time. I think you have a slide, right, with yours. Yeah, you do. Hold on. Go get yours. This is Erin. This is how you can get in contact with her email. You're welcome to, if you think that you qualify for Tala or you have specific legal questions and you're a nonprofit, we do have nonprofit members. Please check out the Tala website and see if you might be eligible to work with an attorney for free. The budget is a $200,000 annual budget and under. We work with the mostly smaller organizations. So if you're over 200,000, we're probably not going to be able to help you on the organizational basis. But please check our website. If you have any questions, call or email us. Please, if you're in Houston, join us next week. The panel is really great. We have representatives from Mid-America, University of Houston, Austin Art League, and Fresh Arts. And so we're going to ask them some rapid fire questions about how they select board members, how they engage their board members, how they raise money, how they think about their budgeting, how they work together with their board. We can ask them anything, and we're going to take questions. So come with your questions too. And we're all going to learn together about more high-level strategic planning next week. So I think that's it. Just want to thank Fresh Arts, who's been our partner for the series, and Texas Commission on the Arts and the National Endowment of the Arts, which also gave funding for this 4-part series. And with that, I think we're finished for the evening.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for your good questions.